Welcome. So, welcome to the 2019 MoDDD Public Lecture, Design Like You Give a Damn, 3 Stories of Design and Social Agency. My name is Esther Charlesworth, and with Judy Rogers, Leila Irajifar and John Feen, teach and convene the MoDDD, or the Master of Disaster Design and Development degree. Before I start, however, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners of the land on which this university stands and recognise elders both past and present. So, having just returned from a 3-day shelter and settlement intensive with Red R Engineers for Relief, colleagues from the International Federation of the Red Cross, I'd first of all like to say thank you to the MoDDD students for whom we wouldn't be here tonight. These were just some of their activities: building shelter kits in kind of 1.5 hours, doing camp planning, and everything in between over the last 2 days. And I'd just like to say that their passion for wanting to change the world through whatever disciplinary lens that is, design, IT, health, insurance, we've got students from all disciplines, is both infectious and kind of overwhelming at times to just kind of acknowledge this generation of students, of colleagues literally wanting to change the world. So just a bit of a plug about our degree. It's a lot of our students wanted jobs yesterday. They don't want to sort of spend 3 years on the theories of international development and so on and so on. And just to say, at least a third of our students who haven't even finished have got jobs as diverse as the World Bank, UNHCR, or are running their own projects. And they are really the testament to the success of the degree 3.5 years into the program.
The Master of Disaster Design and Development is in some ways the encapsulation of the concerns that exist within the School of Architecture and Urban Design at RMIT.
It had a long gestation, maybe 4 or 5 years, and a lot of discussions through the International Federation of the Red Cross, RMIT Europe, the Australian Red Cross, World Vision, people across the world who are really interested in putting together a degree in the Asia Pacific region to train the next generation of humanitarians.
There are going to be increasing disasters around the world. The toll on humankind is going to be very great. If we have a group of people who already have some skills, from a bachelor's degree, from service, in other disciplines, they bring a lot to a degree like this, where you're adding on a new component, dealing with disasters both before, after, and during.
As a graduate student, I had the incredible opportunity to get involved in a project to rebuild Mostar, and it really got me thinking about these issues and the capacity of design to deal with the complexity of social justice, the role of spatial thinking in dealing with these really complex issues of peace, war, disaster and division.
One of the key strengths of MoDDD is that it actually brings together a diverse range of students, not only across different age groups, but also across different disciplines. And it's actually a space where real critical thinking can happen, so that we can start addressing some of the issues that actually we confront but find so difficult to address.
I chose to do the MoDDD degree as it was kind of like a solidifying of almost of the experience that I've been on, working out or developing that past experience in the humanitarian sector through study. During the time as an architect, I did a bit of work with architects about frontiers. I've been to hospital a number of times, so I've been working in that sector a little bit, even though I was only through community development work. But I really wanted to get in there and study. When the MoDDD degree came available, I was like, yeah, I've got to do this. MoDDD has enabled me to transition into the disaster relief sector by opening up opportunities in terms of deployment by radar as an expert on mission to work with UNHCR in Nepal, undertaking site planning for consolidation of the remaining refugee settlements into a single refugee settlement, and working with their temporary shelters to be more robust.
You know, having worked for many years in the industry now, MoDDD popped up and it just seemed to amalgamate all these areas of interest, and not even just in a simple way, in a very broad way. And so I thought this is my chance now to really go deep into my inherent interests about what it can do. And I'm finding now through the course of it that it's not just about things and buildings, it's actually about so much more.
MoDDD is a degree that is built for people who want to learn a lot about disasters and to go into that field. But more importantly, it enhances whatever skills or background that you have so that you can feel better about yourself in the helping professions. MoDDD is the only degree in the world that I know of that really is transformative. It doesn't just give you a skill on how to build a building or how to work with people because they have trauma. It gives you those skills so you can manage all those disciplines and really bring to bear the kinds of skills necessary to run the entire operation, like a Katrina or after a tsunami. Not just to be there, not just to be a helper, but to help manage the thing to the future.
MoDDD's been a really exhilarating, steep learning curve.
It was exciting, challenging, a very diverse but also very focused degree.
MoDDD is engaging, compelling,
eye-opening.
I'm now going to invite my colleague, Associate Professor Katrina Simons, the Discipline Head of Landscape Architecture, to introduce the three speakers for tonight. Thank you, Katrina.
Hello everyone. My name is Katrina Simon. I'm the Associate Dean for the Landscape Architecture discipline here in the School of Architecture and Urban Design at RMIT. The Landscape Architecture discipline incorporates three programs: the Bachelor of Landscape Architectural Design, the Professionally Accredited Master of Landscape Architecture, and the Master of Disaster Design and Development for these people wishing to transform or transition into careers in the humanitarian sector. Across the teaching of these programs and in our related research and engagement with industry and communities, we share a deep concern for our varied landscapes and the people who form and are sustained by relationships with them. And it's great to see so many students, alumni and staff here today, and the wider community brought together by this event. So I'd like to introduce the three speakers for this afternoon. Our first speaker is Jeremy McLeod. Jeremy is the founding director of Breathe Architecture, an environmentally focused and materially accountable design practice based in Melbourne. Breathe instigated the Nightingale housing movement after trialling a new model for delivering housing through the award-winning project of sustainable apartments called The Commons. Jeremy has to leave right at 6, so for the following the talks, for the question and answer session, we'll be joined by Bonnie Herring, the Director of Breathe Architecture and Project Lead on The Commons. The second speaker will be Sandra Durzo, and Sandra is currently a Senior Officer in Shelter and Settlements at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, Geneva. She's the focal person for shelter, risk reduction and recovery and post-disaster operations and shelter programs across Africa and Middle Eastern countries. In 2018, Sandra was awarded the Facebook Community Leadership Award for PASA, Participatory Approach for Safe Shelter Awareness, along with co-founder Jamie Mock. And the final speaker is Finn Pedersen. Finn is a co-founder and director of Iredale Pedersen Hook Architects, a Perth and Melbourne-based studio with a diverse body of work throughout Australia. IPH practice in the fields of housing, education, health, justice and cultural buildings, with a focus on direct engagement with the Indigenous peoples of Australia. Finn is the Vice Chairperson of the Waimando and Jeremy Pike Trusts and was co-founder of Environs Kimberley. So please join me in welcoming the first of these three speakers, Jeremy McLeod.
I've been told to keep it brief, so if you're bored, just give me this one. I studied as an architect, and before I studied as an architect, I studied environmental design. So I studied at Tasmania. I was raised by hippie activist parents who cared deeply about the environment and cared deeply about the way we lived as individuals within society. It was interesting kind of leaving university and practising as an architect and thinking I wanted to be working on a project that would be published in houses and to think historically about what an architect was. And so this is from Greenway's movie, A Draftsman's Contract. And I think that for a lot of us, this idea of housing is fetishised and that, architects are trained as 19th century architects really, so gentlemen drawing houses for other gentlemen. And so what happens, going forward is that we get to the 20th century, or the late 20th century, and we find ourselves, as a profession, that we're designing 3% of the housing in this country. The rest are designed by volume builders, developers, draftspeople. And the 3% of the people that we're designing for are the 3% of the most entitled people in the country. And this is where we find ourselves. So this is Melbourne in the centre and Melbourne at the edges. There's social isolation at in both of these places. And while it's interesting that you should ask me to talk, I feel kind of embarrassing talking about, the housing crisis in Melbourne as a disaster. But for me, as a professional, as an environmentalist, as someone that cares about society, and that someone who's been witness to 26 years of uninterrupted economic growth, and we still have 100,000 people that are homeless in this country, I think that that's a disaster in its own right. And so perhaps the role of the architect now, post, the rise of the project manager, the development manager, the real estate agent, the marketing team, the property developer, perhaps our role should be more about advocacy and less about this idea that we have to draw the perfect bathroom or the perfect stair. And why should we care about that? So we know what happens when you complicit, tools in the trade. It looks like this. And so Bonnie, who will answer some questions later, and I, back in 2007, we saw this population growth happening. And what we can see in Melbourne now is that we're growing at over 100,000 Melburnians every year, year on year. And it's going to do that for the next 35 years. And we have no current way to deal with that. So in the late 80s, the state government gave over housing as their responsibility. The state said it's too hard, we'll let the market decide. And what you see currently is what the market has delivered. So in the city, apartments that are designed to be sold as speculative dog boxes, or, sorry, that's not kind, is it? As investment. So it's sold as a profit, or for profit, and then it gets rented back to Melburnians. So 85% of the housing that you see in Docklands of the CBD is owned by investors. And then first home buyers are forced to the city's edges to buy stock that's poorly built, that's poorly located, and to get there you need multiple cars. And the average cost of owning a car in this country is $11,500 a year after tax, which makes it forces you into a situation where you're economically compromised. We used to do city planning well, and if you think about the late 1850s when SANDRA replanned Barcelona and the incredible kind of rise of incredibly well-built, compact housing back then, it was led by the citizens of Barcelona. So textiles merchants that would build apartment buildings that would be 6 stories tall, they'd live on the first floor, they'd care deeply about their city and how they'd live in it, and then they'd rent out the apartments above there. What happens here is that people just speculate rather than building housing. I'm sorry about the capitalisation in this slide. So that should be lowercase r and lowercase a, but sorry about that. So anyway, for us, in 2007, we had the Kevin 07 election. And for us, as a practice, I think Bonnie, Tamara and I decided that we would take a risk, a leap of faith, that we would act as advocates rather than as tools of the trade. And we decided to embark on a project that we thought we could prove to the development industry that you could build something that was simultaneously sustainable, that built community and that was affordable, and that wasn't impossible. And so we embarked on the Commons. And the idea was that it would be triple bottom line. It would be carbon neutral, it would be zero car, and it would focus on community. And when we completed that building, the way that we proved that you could do it was this idea of sustainability through reductionism. So to build less, to give more. So take out the second bathrooms, take out the individual laundries, take out the basement car parking, and instead put a rooftop laundry where everyone can share and come together. Take out the clothes dryers. And what we were able to achieve was, at that time, the cheapest housing in Brunswick. It was the cheapest kind of apartment building in Brunswick, and it built a really strong sense of community. It's really simple, it's totally imperfect, and the idea was that people would be able to change it over time. Not that many people have changed it. The interesting thing for us was that in 2014, the Commons won all of these awards, and we were surprised by that. Not because we hadn't worked incredibly hard, like Bonnie did an incredible job delivering this building on a really tight budget, but that this building, Bonnie arrived at this building through precedent research. So this type of building exists every day of the week in Copenhagen or in Berlin, but in Australia in 2014 it was seen as this kind of outstanding building. So while thanks for the awards, it's a real worry about the housing or the state of housing in our country. And so what we learned out of that was that good design was only part of the equation, that the decision makers set the goalposts, and if the goalposts are to deliver a speculative product for profit, then that's what you'll get. But if the goalpost is to deliver a triple bottom line housing outcome that's carbon neutral, then that's what you'll get. And so what we learnt, I guess, more than anything was that if the system is broken, you don't design a new building, you design a new system. And so following the Commons, Bonnie opened the building up to tours. We took, every developer in Melbourne through the Commons, every week, trying to educate them, saying that a market for this existed. And after about 18 months, no one really took us up on it. And we were asked to do the same kind of speculative stuff. And so we embarked on the Nightingale model. And the fundamental idea of the Nightingale model was that it's not an architectural process, it's actually a financial model. And the idea was that we could replicate this idea of triple bottom line housing and give it the ability to scale, and scale without our intervention. Fundamentally, it was an idea about the democratisation of capital. So take the bagman developer out of the mix. Instead, get the architect in the middle of the equation, above the project manager, the real estate agent, and get the architect to engage with the end users, the people that would live there, and ask them what it was that they actually need. Because what we found is in Brunswick, when you ask people what they needed, they wanted space and light and outlook and a window that they could open. They didn't want granite bench tops and 1,000 downlights. And then, I guess, fundamentally what the model tries to achieve is that this is the Nightingale model across the bottom here. This is a standard developer model across the top. This is the value in terms of dollars back to the purchasers. And it's about taking out all the stuff that you don't need. So we buy our land at the same price as a developer. We pay our architects the same as a developer, in fact, a little bit more. But we don't engage a marketing team. We don't build a display suite that's not correct in scale or size. We don't engage a real estate agent. We don't pay a real estate agent. Our construction cost actually stays about the same as the developers, because while we might not have a basement or air conditioners everywhere, we have a lush rooftop garden that might cost us $300,000. We have the best double glazing or triple glazing that money can buy. We have thicker walls because we want to insulate the building properly. And then we cap the return to our investors, and we try to source our money through impact investors, whereas a standard development model will obviously charge whatever the market will bear. So in Nightingale 1, the apartments were sold at about $95,000 under market, which means we have a ballot process to be able to allocate those apartments fairly. We want to be able to protect that affordability into the future, so we sell the apartments with a restrictive caveat which says you can resell the apartments at the price you paid for it, plus the indexing of housing in the suburb. So you're buying housing from a Nightingale model, you're not buying an asset. Every building has to be carbon neutral, so you cannot plumb gas into a Nightingale building. And we spend a lot of time, again, not as architects, but as negotiators dealing with Tas Hydro, about being able to buy carbon neutral power at bulk rates and then using that aggregated buy rate between all the Nightingales to share that directly with the residents. So our residents in Nightingale 1 have the cheapest power in Melbourne, and it's all carbon neutral. So Nightingale 1 was completed in 2017. And again, this idea of, building less to give more. Pretty Spartan, pretty simple, but recycled timber floors that are top nailed, not glued. At the end of this building's life in 100 years, this is the only building in Melbourne where the floor will actually be able to be lifted and reused again. It'll be worth something then. The rooftop, really simple. And because we engaged the residents early, we asked them what it is that they need. And what they asked for us, these are sand pits in here under these covers. So they asked really simply, they didn't ask for much, what they asked for was sand pits and grass. So we gave them sand pits and grass with the help of open work. And so what's next for us? So then the idea was to be able to share this model with other architects. And so other architects helped us create Nightingale 1. So Nightingale 2 by 6 Degrees Architects completes next month in Fairfield. Nightingale 3 by Austin Maynard starts construction in Sydney Road in October. Nightingale Brunswick East completes in September this year. And then Nightingale Village. So Nightingale Village was the idea of taking Nightingale and kind of compressing it and scaling it. And so we brought 7 sites together, 7 architects, 7 communities across both sides of a street. 0 privately owned cars, a car share hub for 15 electric vehicles, bike parking for 440 bicycles. And then we got the City of Moreland to agree to close the street and allow us to pull up the asphalt and plant trees. It's not 7 buildings anymore, it's now 6 buildings because the City of Moreland have just bought the northernmost building, Walwalla's building, and they're going to demolish that site, and they're putting a 2,000 square metre park at the northern edge of Nightingale Village now. So we're now getting the City of Moreland engaged in this process with us. And I guess the future for us is to not just share it with current architects, but to share it into the future. So we take a thesis class called Nightingale Night School, and we train 16 Nightingale architects every year, a little bit like you, Esther, with the idea is that they can take everything that we know, understanding finances, development, how to drive and how to source funds and how to drive down the source of that capital to be able to deliver future projects. Thank you very much.
This is to go on. Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sandra D'Urso, as I've been introduced before. I would really like to thank RMIT for getting me here, and I would say specifically to Esther Charlesworth for getting me and insisting so much to get me. Tonight I've been asked to talk about my personal journey somehow, and share some thoughts and experiences that I built over the years. I'm not very used to, it's not what I normally do. I mean, I put my work at the forefront, but this time I've been asked really to get you a bit through the journey of my work and how did I get there. And if this is somehow as inspiration to others to maybe find themselves at the conjuncture of their careers, I'd be very happy that this is so, and it will have been worth all the travel to get here. I'll certainly want to talk about the importance of humanitarian architecture and its application of ethics, as an application of ethics into a profession, and this probably through the work I do. I must say that studying architecture back in the 90s, and that was living in Italy, I did architecture in Rome, it was through a very long, bloody war in Bosnia that was so far so close. I mean, for us, the shelling at night, the bombs that we were hearing from the Croatian coast, and the media somehow telling us horrific stories, horrendous stories about destructions, both of people's lives and of cities, was pretty horrendous and had a strong impact on me. So we'll talk about the genocide, of course, but also about the herbicide. And I do remember, of course, there was a dean of the Faculty of Architecture, Esther might remember, Bogdan Bogdanovic. He was talking about the herbicide. So that was a systematic violence against cities as symbols of culture, identity, memory. And I started thinking myself that that would be maybe, there was certainly need for architects and urban designers in the aftermath of such a destruction. Meeting Esther was somehow instrumental because we both decided to work on one of those divided cities, and Esther was working on many of them. And I did my master's in architecture and urban planning to reunite through a new bridge and public spaces as symbolic public value as well. So I went there just in the aftermath of the war. But then I told myself, after what? I mean, after that, what can I do? I mean, I presented the project, but it was really not easy to get to a pathway towards this combining new skill sets as a fresh architect in this post-conflict setting. So, of course, I needed money, in the sense I needed to kick off my professional career, and I started somehow refurbishing, as many of us do, apartments in Rome, then in Paris, and honestly, I found out after a few months that, of course, designing the cuisine de Madame du 16e was really not my big thing. I mean, with all due respect to those who do it much better than me and do a good job at it. But basically, at that time, I said, how can I do something else? Then I joined Meccano, which is a well-established firm in Holland, which does architecture and good design. So, I mean, they're very social, environmentally conscious architecture. This is the university I was working on in Utrecht at that point. But still, it was very much commercial focused. We were 120 among architects and other disciplines. So it taught me to work along with other disciplines. And that has been a great asset to the rest of my career. So it was getting a bit closer, let's say, closer to the idea that architecture is a service. It is an art that produces things that are needed. Then came a scholarship to do a master's, but I decided it was a bit too much of money to do only the master's, so I decided to do a world solo tour at that point. And my 2000 world solo tour took me to Africa first, then to Australia, and then to South America. It doesn't make me younger, but that was it. And living so many experiences in so many countries at that point, I just, of course, was an eye-opener on the world made of inequities, marginalization, unbalanced access to services. And somehow, what Jeremy said as well, I realized that only 3% of what we have as housing is designed or has assistance by technical qualified architects. And it comes down to 1% in the countries where I'm working in. And that's not even developers, it is just self-built. So, of course, all of this I've seen is exacerbated now over the last 10 years, migration, induced climate change, disaster that are triggered by protracted conflict as well, that has a direct consequence of the growing inequalities. So all this is this mosaic of a world somehow in crisis. So after my travels, I kind of came back and I joined a very small architecture and development as part of the network of Architects Without Borders, and a very small NGO. I was teaching at the Faculty of Architecture in Paris, and we were hosted basically there. And I started working somehow in alliance with NGOs, the medical ones, ISF, handicap, on somehow health posts, reconstruction of public infrastructure in the list of countries that you see here. So, of course, it was a lot of, again, post-emergency work. While I did a master's in Barcelona, so it was a lot with matching also some of those travels in those places with research, operational research that was combinable with this master. I realized that each time somehow that I tried to reply with building spaces, I try to reply to basic human needs, we somehow produce architecture. It's not a matter of scale or function, it's a matter of dignity, of human dignity. And in my view, there is no other more basic need and fundamental needs such as dignity. So I think also architecture produced in such contexts of despair is not marginal. At one point, it is a critical, crucial contribution to survival. Next one. Yeah. And this, of course, maybe 10 years ago, the idea was that people were still only on the move caused by economic migration and conflict, but now the vast majority, we know it, is moving due to extreme weather conditions. The cycles of floods, droughts, fire, and winds is what is causing it. So at one point of my juncture as well, it was, okay, but how do I assist? Who do I turn to? Can it be, I mean, does it have to be in emergencies elsewhere? Who are the most vulnerable in such conditions? Is it urban displaced? Is it people stranded in limbos of camps? Is it people on the move? Is it youth, maybe? People that are undocumented? And of course, as soon as you turn, there is such a fragmentation now of vulnerabilities all over. So I couldn't really find the way to scale up my capacity. At one point, I did, there was a trigger, which has been the East Ocean tsunami. And the tsunami had, for me, was a turning point, of course, in my journey, as I was called by Oxfam GB at that point to basically be the national shelter advisor throughout Sri Lanka. And I worked in Sri Lanka for over 3 years, in and out, and basically on responding to the immediate needs of people that lost houses, lost livelihoods, lost everything, of course, but also in a second phase after the war that the north of Sri Lanka experienced. And I want to say something here, because the upper strip, as you see, I mean, I was, of course, involved directly, monitoring on houses. And in the first phase, we built about 3,000 houses in east and north. But somehow I saw that disaster response could tackle some of the underlying factors, such as of inequity, such as access to land rights for women, and we titled Rights in Name of Both Men and Women. Disability inclusion, you can maybe see the picture up there with myself with a family, two out of the three, it's the grandfather and the mother of the child. The child has Down syndrome and the grandfather was visually impaired, and that was not an exception. Many of the people had at least one or two people disabled in the family. So disability inclusion and access to services, I think that was an essential part of this crucial program. So again, here in the under part, it was very much designing housing, but with an idea of the process and not the product. We often say it, but in this case, it was really, we built in 3 years 20,000 houses, but the assistance was with cash support, financial support, technical support, and a lot of participatory approaches. Tested, reused. So basically, it was the idea that housing is incremental and is progressive. Next one. Of course, with the tsunami, we all thought that it was the one big tsunami, will never happen again. We had this incredible amount of solidarity, and it would be the exception for the century. But then it became not the exception, but the norm. We see cycles, we see tsunamis again, we see people and communities that are not that better prepared. So somehow, I think that there is a desperate need for architecture and built environment expertise, because conflicts and climate-induced displacement will not stop. So the future is both in, of course, cities and the ability for cities to grow in a peaceful and safer modality, but also probably to assist people where they are with different housing typology, and we'll see which ones. What I did when I came back from Sri Lanka and my Asian experience, I joined the Red Cross movement. I somehow had this idea that there was a commitment also for the Red Cross to take up shelter, and there was a unit, an entire unit created at that time. And of course, yeah, people ask me, well, how come an architect with your background now joins the Red Cross? Aren't they doing just public health? And what is your role in it? And of course, I was even pregnant at that time, so it was, how can you combine the equation of being a woman, working on disasters, and even having a child? So many thought that it was one or two or more emergencies that I would do and then somehow would stop. And here am I. It's 10 years later. I do have 3 kids in the meantime, and I still work on disasters. Next one. I worked on disasters last month. As you can see, for instance, both as first responders with the volunteers on the ground in Mozambique. This is Mozambique. I sent people. I'm not there yet. But, of course, while we are responding, which is a large part of the Red Cross work, we are also looking at recovery needs directly, with people, for people, and that's really within very fragile ecosystems. As you see here, this coastal belt has been completely flooded, and the floods have not receded yet. And we see that on and on. I mean, the fact that it's not only a matter of responding to emergencies, if we don't increase the awareness at community level of shelter-related risks, the vulnerabilities can only increase. And that's where the project I have been mostly working on the last decade, I would say, is this PASA, which is a tool and a participatory approach for safe shelter awareness. Next one. And I've been working on this tool specifically with the idea that we are working a lot with volunteers. And we are working with volunteers, not just the Red Cross volunteers. We're trying to see and tap into volunteer and activism in a new way. And I've seen it over in Mexico, and I've seen it in Ecuador with the earthquakes. People and architects and built environment professionals just do want to help, and they want to help with their profession. And they create coalitions and services, they volunteer. Their capacity to mobilize as grassroots is quite incredible. So I really am happy to say that maybe this conjuncture now between humanitarian response and community development starts to grow and build itself in new ways. One of the projects, so PASA, is a tool, and at the end it's a way to achieve co-creation and co-design of space, of shelter and housing, and that in very complex areas of the world. This is in Port-au-Prince, where one of the outcomes of the PASA, of this participatory approach, which is community action planning. It's not more than that, but it has over time created about, hundreds of micro projects, whether it is improving housing individually, whether it's creating safe spaces for children, or a wide range of things that can be done at community level with the support of architects is happening. Community and neighborhood plans, of course, put into action. Ultimately, it's a matter of analyzing, planning, using the best technologies we have now also to map, to build scenarios, and ultimately to have community action plans that then can be supported in different ways. And here we see it is building a market, it is building drains or better coverage for public spaces. So it has a vast variety of outcomes. And I've started in 3 places. I've started to test PASA in Uganda, in Haiti, and in Bangladesh. And then over the last 7-8 years, we have grown from 3 to 30 countries where with several partners we're using it. So it is really, we're the facilitators and the advocates for it. As Jeremy said, probably, yes, more than being the architects and prescribing things, we're the advocates to somehow articulate the community demands for better space and better shelter. Ultimately, as we said, we also adapted it now for youth so that we tap into youth and adolescents with the idea that youth can engage in meaningful way and positive way in communities that are high at risk. And for that idea, we have won just now this fellowship, which will allow us to build a knowledge management platform so that communities that come up with several risks, but different responses can communicate and engage with each other. And even in the most remote communities, this is in rural Nepal, PASA has been a tool to articulate the demands and become somehow a routine problem-solving tool for them and empower women, empower a number of people in innovative ways for them. I'm going on quickly. Somehow reimagining housing, housing typologies and services is also at the forefront of work. As we said, yes, we can do slum upgrading and look at most impoverished urban environments, but mostly so many of the communities where we're working are not wanting to go anywhere. But the problem is that floods, for instance, here, which were very punctual, Colombia, a community along the river in the Amazons, an Afro-descendant community, was impoverished over the years by the continuous floods. So they had to live nearly on the first floor. What do? We needed for these two 250 families to find solutions which were changing the typologies of housing, lifting them on stilts, and working on considerations of environmental education, risk reduction, preparedness, but especially so working alongside to combine new ways of living with new housing typologies. And this is happening in many of the projects we start working on. This is again in Sri Lanka, but it was process over product, because the product is, well, a beautifully designed library, but the point is that there was a lot of support in transferring technologies. Here it is on rammed earth, because this idea of whatever we do, there is ways to do it with people and with projects that really have a social inclusion component. The last slide I'd like to mention is that also, I mean, when I'm here, it is also because I love to combine research with the educational aspect. So we have combined work with universities. This is the Torino University in Italy that has been winning a design competition here, which was around flood-resilient housing in coastal belts as well. So, of course, it is very important now to be at this stage in which we can combine our own practice with engaging with masters or with universities that wish to advance both the research and action around this. So, of course, last words, I do think that the future lies in all our hands jointly. I'd like to conclude that architects and built environment specialists have not just the role, but I would say really the duty now to address some of the most pressing needs that I have somehow highlighted tonight. Time's up, I know it, for the short term, but probably time's up also for making up our choices and to design like we all give a damn. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Thanks for inviting me, Esther and Martin, and the School of Architecture. I'm Vin Peterson from Ardale Peterson Hook Architects. We're a small practice in Western Australia. There's 10 of us in our studio and Martin in Melbourne. And I'm going to try and talk about agency in architecture and the kind of stuff we do. And I think Design Like You Give a Damn was a book that was produced more than 10 years ago now. And one of the interesting things about it was there was Paul Felleros, who's one of our heroes in architecture, and he's the guy in the middle. We actually have two other heroes in our office. One is Cedric Price and probably Peter Cook, who actually ask us the questions of, do we really need a building? And in fact, is a building the essential thing that we need to do in architecture? The other thing that's critical to us is we're kind of operating in Australia in our Indigenous work in this notion of perhaps a fourth world disaster, this post-colonial society with this myth of endless progress and growth and this sort of election cycle amnesia where we forget about everything until the next election cycle, and this idea of a triple bottom line disaster rather than sustainability. And our realms of operation is obviously in most of it in Western Australia, this wonderful, Tyndall map of the Aboriginal language groups of Australia, underpinned by the geological maps of the mines and the minerals of Western Australia and Australia, and on the right is the little constellation of our projects spread across Western Australia. It's our kind of brag sheet, really. And I suppose, in a way, the idea of advocacy has been spoken about a lot. I mean, Monash had Dana Cuff come out in 2017, and she spoke about advocacy, and she talked about 5 principles. Sorry, this is playing automatically, which I wanted to stop. And her talk was really interesting, and it's worth actually watching. It's available online, but it's very urban focused, and in a way our projects kind of talk a little bit about the regional and remote areas of Australia and the cultures there, and how do we bring advocacy to those cultures. So overcoming this metrocentric idea, which sort of exists around our peripheral fringe lifestyle of Australia. Our realms of operation, we talk about place and people and cultures. Our places are often remote and regional. There's diversity in extreme climates and landscapes. There's varying community sizes. There's very limited ability to deliver services to these communities. This is in the Kimberley. This is Warman community, which was wiped out in the floods that a flood on the same day as Queensland was wiped out. And in the realm of operations of people is looking at distinct, in these remote areas, distinct nations and language groups that are culturally diverse communities. There's a common history of colonisation and intergenerational trauma and changing demographics and aspirations within those communities, and cultural practices and traditional law varies from community to community. And the social conditions and living patterns also vary continuously over the sort of 20 years of our practice. This is Warman Aged Care Centre being smoked. The other idea is the idea of program that we work in there, this program of different types of buildings, and often there's a tendency for programs to be driven by the funding agencies or the governing bodies. But the interesting thing about program is that we are actually an advocate, in this case this is West Kimberley Regional Prison, not only for the prisoners and their families, but also for the staff working in a prison. And you actually have to advocate for all the building users, not just the immediate obvious users, which in the case of an Aboriginal prison, custom-made prison, that was driven by a brief that was written by the families of the West Kimberley and the East Kimberley. It's a very interesting way of unpacking those things and making sure that the people who use these facilities are fully represented on both, particularly in custodial facilities on both sides. Recently, our social advocacy has worked in the southwest of Western Australia with the Noongar community. We work with the Lions on Yagan Square, which has just recently been finished. It's the first urban project in Western Australia that's actually been deliberately designed to try and include Aboriginal people in its design and its operation, and to really give back to the Noongar people of the southwest some place they can call their own. It's incredibly effective and an amazing project to have worked on with Lions. And Yagan Square, in a way, is a really good example of how you could do this in an urban setting, taking our lessons that we've learnt from 20 years of working in remote regional areas. Other areas of social advocacy that we do is aged care and the emerging, it's been there forever, aged care, but for us it's a new emerging area of advocacy. In this case, this is Swan Care, which is a retirement village for 1,000 people in the suburbs of Perth. One of the interesting things about this project is it's creating a village centre, and we use model making a lot, and one of our first client meetings involved a client who was blind, and we didn't realise she was blind, and we luckily had bought our model, and she felt our model, so we had an interactive inclusion consultancy with this model, and 2 weeks later we changed the model and shortened verandas, and she said, "You've shortened the veranda on the model." It was this incredible, oh, of course, yeah. The other social agency that we have in terms of our diverse array of works is this idea of, and this is hot off, this is wet, the ink on this slide, is social agency for people with extreme disabilities, in this case some young men who have extreme autism. They need 24/7 care. They're what's probably known as low functioning autism, so they actually need, one of the guys actually can't do anything himself. He's pretty much locked in, but he's physically mobile. And so we're designing accommodation facilities for them and their families and their carers to actually live their lives. These guys will live for a long age, but they have very, very interesting interactions with the world around them, and how do we design homes for them that give them meaningful and dignity in their lives. Education Department of the State of Western Australia is very conservative in its programming, but we've managed to actually take on board, we have semi-privatised schools in the Education Department. They have private boards now that run the schools, and this is a primary school, and they wanted to use Reggio Emilio principles in the school curriculum, which the Education Department was terribly scared of, because they were, what is this strange stuff? And we found that there were so many synergies in doing that we could advocate for the community groups within the school community back to the Education Department and give them both projects, both a Reggio Emilio overlay and formal meet the brief curriculum. This is a justice centre in Kununurra. It's a courthouse, and this courthouse was about engaging with the Murruwang Gadjurong people. Most of the users of the courthouse in Kununurra, at least sort of 70–80% of them are Aboriginal people, and they're there for feuding. They're there for the kind of fallout of the post-colonial scenario that they're in. And how do you get these people a space? How do you create a space that allows families to come and use the building without conflicting to it? How do you do no harm? How do you design a courthouse and a foyer of a courthouse that respects cultural practices and prevents further violence? This is an image on the left-hand side by Reverend Thomas, who is a resident of a Warman community many years ago, has passed on now. But in Aboriginal culture in the East Kimberley, storms and climate events are not actually, from a cultural perspective, they're not just weather events, they're a cultural event. And the idea in Warman and the Gidja people is that this cultural event, the flood that took out Warman, actually has greater cultural significance, none of which I can share with you because it hasn't been shared with me. I'm not eligible to talk about that stuff, but I'm aware that it exists. And when we design buildings in these areas, there are conversations that we know we can't have, but we get little nudges about things that we need to take on board. So respecting that there's a whole pile of knowledge that we can't talk to or talk about, but need to know a little bit about. So that reflects in our housing design as well. So this building is a very simple building. On one side, the men and the women separating Gidja community. The women are at the top of the page, the men are at the bottom of the page. They're elders who are, they're the holders of law and culture. They transfer law and knowledge to the kids and the young members of the community. The building is right next to the school, so the kids have this huge interaction with it. It's in the floodplain, this idea of building where people want to build, regardless of what the waters are doing. This building's up on legs, which is unusual for an aged care centre. So you have men's, women's separation, and then common areas on the left-hand side where the community can gather and practice law and culture and celebrate Gidja culture. This idea of surveillance, we call it cultural surveillance, this ability that Aboriginal people, or this need that Aboriginal people across Western Australia have expressed to us, this need to see people moving around their communities, to be aware of their relationships of different people in the community, their reciprocal relationships and their avoidance relationships, and how that works with their other sites in the community, beyond just the people, but also to the creation sites or the objects around and the views into the landscape. The beautiful landscape of Warman and the Turkey Creek Valley, which can be lethal at times. We're up on, this is shortly after completion of the building. And the kids interacting with the family, cooking up a wallaby there. This is the smoking ceremony and the opening of the community. There's another crisis that happened at Warman after this. They were embezzled by about $2 million. I won't go into that, but it's worth reading about. Classic post-disaster scenario where the evil villains come out and try to take advantage of people. This is a small This next project's in Fitzroy Crossing. Fitzroy Crossing is a constellation of little outstations on the Fitzroy Valley in the heart of the Kimberley. There's 5 language groups who were brought to Fitzroy Crossing in 1968 when equal wages movement threw all the Aboriginal people off their homelands, and they were actually banished pretty much to Fitzroy Crossing itself. It's an amazing myriad of different organisations who are trying to do great things. Munkatjar Arts, Ningalingari, a cultural health services area, the Women's Centre, Barrawarrawara, essential service providers, this wonderful painting community. The right-hand side is the native title map, the Nura canvas, which is about their native title claim. And these are all of our community groups that we had to consult with for this renal hostel. So the renal hostel is a 19-bed renal hostel for Aboriginal people in renal dialysis. And before this happened, people actually had to die or go to Derby or to Perth to get renal dialysis. And people were choosing to stay in their communities and die rather than actually move. So that idea of connection to land is profoundly moving when people choose to die rather than leave their family and their country. This is Fitzroy Crossing as an island in a wet season. This happens we had a terrible dry year this year, but every 5 years or so, Fitzroy becomes an island and people move from the hostel to the dialysis unit on that image. And we were given a piece of land, which is usually, as usual in a lot of remote towns, the empty pieces of land are usually empty for a good reason. This one had a drain running through the middle of it, which is this brown area running across the site. And these little houses are actually made up of little 1 or 2 bedroom rooms with all the cooking being done in the amenity building on the right-hand side. We looked at the country where all these people are from, the 5 language groups, and we tried to find plants from those language areas that we could actually plant on their landscaping plan. A lot of those are bush tucker or bush medicine plants, and so gradually people are collecting seed and growing these different plants on the site and actually around the different clusters of buildings. So I won't go into the plans of the buildings. They're very, very simple buildings, but it sits in this incredible landscape that goes emerald in the wet season and buff in the dry season. But effectively, these people don't have medical needs as such, so they're not eligible for aged care, but they've got diabetes, type 2 diabetes, which involves a lot of amputations, and often people are in wheelchairs, so there's ambulant issues. Cultural surveillance is overlaid over this project, so these wonderful shades are actually facing west where the afternoon sun comes. They also aim views, so people aren't looking at each other's houses. People can sit on their porches and see people going by from a cultural surveillance perspective, and they're protected also from view from other people. There's dual access paths around the community, so if your mother-in-law is walking up a path towards you, you can find another route around her, so you can practice avoidance relationships. last project, I told you I'd talk fast. This is our last project. This is this idea of how do we talk about culture, how do we be culturally respectful, and how do we actually, as an architect, give skills to people who want to talk about their culture. So like Yagan Square was about cultural awareness and promoting that to the wider community, this project is called Bilya Court Budja. In Northam, it's the Balladong people of Western Australia, and this is a state-funded, a Commonwealth-funded project that was delivered by a local government agency, but the responsibility was given to Aboriginal community to actually develop the project. And we worked hand in hand with Thylacine, who are interpretive designers. So on one level this is a training centre, and on another level this is actually a live museum or a live education centre for Aboriginal culture. It sits on the river in Northam. It faces southwest, so there's this incredibly beautiful screen that we had to create that buffers the afternoon sunlight from the building. This is a smoking ceremony, people going into the building. And in the building, we worked with Thylacine to design the actual exhibit spaces, which talk about Balladong Noongar culture, a bunch of white guys and women talking about Aboriginal culture. So we're actually acting as a skill base and a way of actually presenting law and culture and aspects of life from a Balladong Noongar perspective, and giving skills to people to actually elevate their stories and the content of their language and their culture to the wider public, and also back to the Noongar community. This is a welcome zone. It's a performance piece that the community made, so Thylacine then helped them produce and record this wonderful immersive performance piece. And then there's a traditional museum-like layout inside the museum centre. Birak is the first summer in Noongar, and as we move around the space, there's a series of co-central rings of the information that are delivered to people visiting it, including in the far right-hand corner some of the first Aboriginal artefacts in the West Australian Museum collection from 1889. Beautiful interaction with the community is a touch screen. These kids are going through this touch screen and pulling up images of their own content, of their family members, of stories. And in the middle of it is a two-layered yarning circle where we recorded people sitting around a fire and then talking about various stories, some of which were cultural stories, some of which were heartbreaking stories, funny stories about law and culture, about hunting, young people's stories about their future aspirations, stories about prejudice, and stolen generation stories. This is my last slide. If I can get it to stay there, I can't. Can you do that? Can you fly? One of the things I suppose I wanted to try and summarise all that dumping of information is sense and consequence. You know, what kind of oh dear, want it to stop. I know. Pause. Thank you. Oh, but it was good. It got me through. Yeah. Sense and mitigation. So there's mitigation tools. There's this idea that we have to generate cultural competency, and you can do that through cultural awareness training. It's really important to do that. But there's also the real experience of doing that training and understanding what trauma is and how to deal with trauma. I think there's sort of overlap between this kind of weird fourth world condition that's wrapped around Australia as a living, ongoing disaster because of colonisation is something that would be interesting to wrap our heads around. This idea of engagement, of listening and to seek endorsement of what you do and to listen to the community and let it to be community-driven is vitally important. And to develop regional and local knowledge. You know, you can't wander into a place like the helicopter gunship and try and deliver architectural built projects. It has no meaning and no engagement if you do it that way. You have to avoid complacency as well, and you have to observe and support the existing systems. I think in a way I thought maybe what we need to do is we need to listen, we need to connect. Fundamentally, we need to do no harm to these systems. You need to be able to, you need to promise only what you can deliver, because you can't actually deliver a lot of things you want to deliver, and to be truthful. You need to hold your nerve, which is a Corrigan quote, and you need to give a damn. Thank you.
Well, just before Jeremy scoots out the door to another night school, or? Yep. I'd just like to thank the three speakers so much. So I think we've heard three incredible stories of design and social agency, from Brunswick to Mozambique to the Kimberleys. Three different ways of practising architecture in such a kind of a fragile planet. And even the first comments that I think Jeremy and then Finn raised again, that in fact we're living in a disaster zone right here, right now. And we don't have to go to necessarily, I mean we do, but all of the other territories that Sandra mentioned. So thank you. And I'd just like to invite now Sandra, Bonnie and Finn, just as a bit of a Q&A. We might just get the lights up on the audience if that's okay. And I can ask this question. Is our boss, so we can. So we saw these many typologies of the designer, of the architect. Jeremy spoke about the architect as advocate, Sandra as the humanitarian, Finn as the post-colonial actor, as perhaps the arbiter of Indigenous justice. Is design education from Geneva to Rome to Perth to Melbourne preparing us for these roles? Sandra?
Well, in this setting, I would say yes, of course. No, in the sense that I feel privileged because, of course, in the last few years, probably there is an increasing interest and somehow there are avenues for education, but more so after the curriculum to take masters into this field. It is still not mainstreamed. I think that definitely I'm being seen as somehow, oh, well, you're doing this exotic branch of architecture, humanitarian something. And it's definitely still not something that is as it should be in the sense of social agency or social role. I would call it maybe also architectural activism. So maybe the activism part, which whether it's here or elsewhere, you need to be actively part of listening to a community, understanding their needs, and then, as I said, transforming those in better living conditions and built environment. So I have definitely a mixed feeling that I see that there have things have progressed and probably the appetite and interest is more there. But whether our curricula are designed now, let alone in universities, which in Italy, for instance, are still very conservative, that is not the case. And I'm struggling when I say in Italy, I mean, we have, for instance, even to deal with a migrant crisis that might be nothing compared to other countries, but still it is a crisis in which housing needs to be reinvented in new forms and new ways, and we need to listen to the needs of people coming from elsewhere. It is taught in no place in the architecture faculties or studies. It comes down to a few professors that then would dedicate a seminar here and there, but nothing that would be providing a transformation really in the architectural curriculum.
Maybe I should just, I think I'll comment just to around the realm of my operations, because I think it would be hard for me to comment more broadly than that. I think what's interesting is that education is not, I'm not thinking about just students here, I'm actually talking about agency representatives, so project officers working for departments of health or justice or education even, that, you know, there is a raising awareness of Aboriginal cultural issues, and they're actually biting into those things. So they're certainly from a justice and a corrective services perspective and a health perspective, they're the kind of pointy edge recipients of having to deliver these systems in these communities, and they really understand what it means to have a large number of people being overrepresented in their system. So the idea of the prison being a lock and leave it kind of punishment centre to it being actually a rehabilitation and training facility, which is kind of what Debbie Prison is clearly in their minds, and it's getting through to government members, you know, that ministers, and not so much ministers because of the cycle and the merry-go-round of forgetting, you know, but more so senior bureaucrats who actually have to run these organisations year in, year out. They know that they have to do this stuff. So I think that's a great a great thing, and that's actually happening. From a student perspective, I think it does come down to, the right people in core schools and in growing awareness if there are people who are focusing on those areas. So in some cases there are, yeah.
I guess a lot's been said there, and I think, the perils of our time are not as visible here, and I think that's the greatest shame in some ways, because we're not necessarily designing for the future, we're designing certainly for our back pockets a lot of the time. And so I think as students, you're given this gift of design thinking, which can really, it's about problem solving, and everything we do is a bespoke response, and so we're going to make mistakes, but you've got to do it with your eyes open and ideally learn about the world around you, because it's not really taught in university. That agency is something you own and you cultivate yourself, and ultimately that'll be your rudder that gives you that conscience, that those core values that should be reflected in your design.
I might just, before we head out for drinks, I'm sure there are some burning questions here in the audience. I can see some of our mod students. Zena, could you just stand up and maybe say your name?
Hello, my name is Z. I'm part of the mod degree. I've only just started, so fairly new. I just had a question in terms of, sorry, I've got two. I'm just trying to decide which one. In terms of for Bonnie, Jeremy mentioned a lot about homelessness in the first part of his speech. I just wanted to know, how does the Nightingale concept and principles work with homelessness in Melbourne or in other areas? Because it's a high rate in Sydney and in Melbourne, and I'm just wondering, do you accommodate for something like that, or is the Nightingale principle and design only for currently people who can afford to purchase and can afford to rent?
Great. It's a great question, and I wish it could accommodate more. Essentially, it's one solution to a big housing problem. There really needs to be many solutions. And at the moment, the type of model that it is really competing with a typical development product, and that development product is not accessible to the homeless population or the people that identify as homeless. And so I would love to say more. There are a bunch of relationships that Nightingale Housing are trying to develop with other housing associations, Women's Property Initiative, Housing Choices Australia, things like this, in order to allocate a portion of the overall development so that it can be an integrated, inclusive community. But there are limitations just simply through the development cost, the development mechanism. I'd like to see it be able to do more, but at this time, unfortunately, it's not helping those people.
Might also add on that, affordable housing and lack of affordable housing also leads to homelessness. So in a way, you're already addressing that by providing affordable housing in the future. So I think
absolutely,
it all around.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Bridget. I'm just wondering, a number of you spoke about coming up against really conservative attitudes, especially with like regulatory authorities, that kind of thing. I guess coming from more of an activist perspective, I can get really angry about that, but I know it's not very effective. So what's your way of dealing with, I guess, conservative attitudes if you're trying to get a humanitarian project off the ground, or deal with, I guess, Yagan Square or that kind of thing? Does that make sense?
It's interesting. I think you've got to be fairly fearless and say things for what they are within a certain context. You actually, I have an old friend who is I've worked with him for years in the Kimberley, and he's now an advisor in state government. But he can go into a room with the most hard-nosed rednecks, racists, and actually have a beer with them and chat to them and somehow manage to just sort of talk to them and turn them really subtly. And I think activism can be a bit more subtle than, you know, chaining yourself to a tree, and there are a time and a place for doing that. Don't let me stop you. But I think there is this ability when you're dealing with bureaucracy to actually show people why they're wrong. And it's a bit like climate change. You know, everyone who's been working this area for, you know, since the 80s has always run into this thing that the science is good and is robust, and it's getting more and more robust. But eventually people come around because they can't deny the kind of realities of what you're asking for. And in fact, they start looking pretty stupid if you've got a group of people and you gradually bring them around, because the number of idiots in the world, I think, are actually outnumbered by the number of sensible people in the world. And I think in a weird kind of way, we actually just need to show people and kind of remove the ignorance which is actually generating that stupidity. Yeah.
One more question. Hi, my name is Sophia. I'm from Canada. I flew in yesterday, actually, so thank you all for all sharing your ideas. This question is for Finn. It's about the Indigenous culture and how do we preserve and restore Indigenous housing across Indigenous communities through the use of technology, but without taking away from this cultural element. Is this even possible in this era? Highlight a bit.
Yeah, it's really, first of all, I need to do this. I have this kind of disclaimer that I like to say at this moment in time, that I don't represent Aboriginal communities, and I have had the beautiful privilege of working with so many communities, but it's always a really uncomfortable thing that you go down a path and you find out you're working directly with communities, and people ask you lots of questions about communities, and it's really terrible. But, you know, I don't have an Aboriginal architect here working for me who can answer these questions, because there's just so few working in the field, and certainly none working in Western Australia at the moment. That's my thing, my disclaimer. We've worked in housing for, you know, over 20, 25 years. My first job was with an Aboriginal corporation in remote area housing. And in pretty much all cases, when I go to a community and I start an interview process and say, well, what kind of housing do you want? What do you need? Everyone wants a house. There is a kind of a romantic neo-hippie myth that Aboriginal people want to live free and practice their culture and all this sort of stuff. In my experience, every Aboriginal family I've ever worked with has wanted a house and wanted something to live in and keep the rain out and keep the dust out and the snakes and the flies. And so, in a way, a house, in many cases, functions in a very similar way to a lot of Aboriginal community houses. There's not much difference. In some communities and in some demographics within communities, those family groups might use the house separately. So in some cases, if you've got a community where, and this is getting rarer now because as communities are changing, the really old traditional people from the deserts have almost all died out. So the idea of sleeping rough around a house and living in the windsock house, in my master's at RMIT, I spoke about a windsock house, a house that blows around and inside of a house. I suspect that those people are few and far between now. I think those generations have actually died. I think they're much less so in my encounter. And so I think technologies, I always refer back to Paul Felleros and Fixing Houses for Better Health, so have a look at their website. He worked on the National Indigenous Housing Guide. He, in fact, wrote it. And that document is our best document for consolidating how one would approach community housing in remote Aboriginal communities, and it actually applies to near-town communities. And in fact, Paul, towards the end of his life, did the same thing in New York. He went into some of the tower blocks in New York and applied his Fixing Houses for Better Health strategy to people living in tower blocks in New York. And so there's this incredible synergy to the commonality of how we use houses, and it goes beyond culture. Yes, there are cultural overlays. Yes, there's cultural practices and stuff that we need to fold in, but it's not really about the technologies. The technology of a house in a remote location needs to be robust and needs to be finite, needs to be easily fixed by a guy with a spanner and a screwdriver. And I've said this before, and you know, Glenn's Yirrkala house with its beautiful timber screens and its gas lifters, it doesn't work on remote Aboriginal communities that I've worked on. A gas lifter in a marine environment lasts for about 12 months and then you've got to replace it. So you've got to use dumb technology. The more remote you are, the dumber the technology's got to be.
And I think it's a great moment to acknowledge the great role that people like Paul Falleros and the late Graham Saunders, who was instrumental in getting MoDDD off the ground, and Sandra's former boss, have paid. And in fact, the influence of people like Paul. So I was at the largest Syrian refugee camp 2 years ago, Al-Zatari, in Jordan, and I came across an Australian architect who was the main camp planner there, who'd worked for Paul. But now she was kind of, you know, planning 80,000 dwellings. And so, you know, there are so few people like that. They've had such an extraordinary impact on a whole generation of people. And I think we feel fortunate to have known them, you know, during their lives. Maybe just one last question, if there's a burning question. It's not a burning question, then we'll burn the house down. No. Raf, good.
This might be for Jeremy, who's not here, but what do we do about developers? You've got rid of them in the equation, and how do we stop them and the market taking control of housing?
I'll do my best. I think some of the things that we've always tried to do is to try and teach the market what a better future looks like, and to make it so desirable that the market needs to shift. And we like to think from time to time that that has actually happened. The amount of people that call and say, "Why did you spec brass? We're going to do it now," and you know, just little questions that you end up sharing with your architectural community because market is starting to demand it is really wonderful. But certainly we would like to see a bigger shift in that way, and I'm fairly frustrated with having those same conversations with our developer clients because, you know, the market does need to shift to make this bigger change.
Okay.
Add on.
Oh, sorry.
30 seconds to that, bringing it also to the perspective of, from Australia to the world in that sense, the system needs to change. I've been lately to Beirut, to Nairobi, to Lagos, to a number of cities that are growing on models that are just unsustainable. And maybe in, was it the activist Greta, 16-year-old's world, if the system doesn't find solutions for us, we need to change the system. And I really like your approach, but of course it does work in Denmark, in Berlin, in Australia, but how do we take that into a Beirut, into systems that are so anchored on privatization of everything? There is not a single public transport in such a city. And there is, of course, I mean, we name it up of greed, of political choices, bad choices, but if we could, and we're trying to do it in coalition with many other actors, which are both humanitarian development actors, on alliances for urban crisis as well, saying this cannot go on like this, because otherwise we're creating not just our own problems, but we need to change that system. And for housing, it becomes, I mean, for mobility, but for housing, it is becoming critical, of course.
Well, thank you again. And again, just thanks to my colleagues, Judy Rogers, John Feen, and Leila Irajifar for working and inspiring the generation of students who are studying in the MoDDD degree, and the students themselves that are here in the audience, or those who have graduated like Raf. So I'd like to just invite you to give our three speakers some applause, and then please come and be our guests out in the lobby.
Yeah, this is certainly the